So good morning again. We continue our conference, and now I would like to introduce the next speaker. And this speaker is Dr. Gabriel Masfa, and he will present a topic, Lord gives us Africa or we die. African local evangelists and their approaches to making converts in early Adventism. Dr. Masfa is a professor at the Adventist University of Africa, and his emphasis is in the church history. So now we will see his presentation. While we are waiting for presentation to be started, I just want to encourage and remind everyone that you can ask questions. So please do this.
Good morning. My name is Gabriel Masfa, and I'm happy to present this paper before you today. The paper is titled, Lord, Give Us Africa or We Die, African Local Evangelists and Their Approaches to Making Converts in Early Seventh-day Adventism, 1900s, 1980s. And I believe the paper connects with the themes of the conference. My name is Gabriel Conversion, and I'm happy multiple to contexts and multiple perspectives before you today. By the 1980s, Western missionaries almost entirely left their former colonies and returned home, and their approaches although to they still tried to adopt a paternalistic attitude towards the mission field. Of Jesus' redeeming grace from their own brethren who taught them in their own languages. None of them were forced to accept the message, but they all recognized its significance as their brethren. The pioneers highlighted that Jesus would end all sufferings and hand to each a new mansions in gold and pearl. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, hundreds of thousands of these agents traveled hundreds of miles on foot, resisting deadly rainforest storms and thunders and lightning to share the gospel, mostly unpaid. They were mostly unpaid. As Christianity spread through the efforts of the apostles and unnamed ordinary individuals in the first centuries around the Mediterranean Sea, so was the case with Christianity in the early 28th century in Africa. As Peggy Brock wrote, Christian beliefs were spread by ordinary people whose numbers grew as colonial development increased mobility. So just as with the unnamed missionaries in the Bible, the experiences of countless local agents of missions in Africa remained largely undocumented. That's the same thing as regard to Adventist local evangelists. Thus, if as some are said, the missionary movement was part of a larger imperial project of cultural colonialism, it is important to recognize that the foot soldiers of the advance were the indigenous preachers. These are the local pioneers. They communicated their own understanding of Christianity based partly on what missionaries had taught them and partly on their own cultural assumptions. If they did not know much about European values and culture, the local agents of Christian mission in Africa had masterly understanding of their own cultures. They had the knowledge of cannibalism, witchcraft, sorceries, and other unchristian practices of the traditional African religions. They confronted these cultural practices with their essential knowledge of the Bible. They made a huge impression on African societies as they defied evil practices, and the doom pronounced by the defenders of these practices had no effect on the agents of God's missions. Now, if the French and the British in the 19th century spoke of missions as design enterprises meant to convert non-Christians such as the Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, Confucians, and traditionalists, for Seventh-day Adventist new evangelists and their mentors, the converts were to be sought even among the Christian denominations. And they highlighted the Sabbath message and coupled with the distinctive teachings of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which the other Christian churches did not preach. As G.A. Hyde, a missionary in northern Nigeria, reported in 1951, the majority of the teachings in these missions is carried out by the members themselves. These are the members, the local people themselves. So one of the first things that we do, as wrote Hyde, we take the gospel to them, and we teach them to read the Bible for themselves. Then, as they learn to read and write, and so study the Bible for themselves, they immediately, while still people, join the teaching band, helping others who do not know as much as they do. The GC Executive Committee noted in 1948 that the growth of Adventism in Africa was largely the result of the work of hundreds of native evangelists trained in our schools who go out into the highways and byways with their Bibles and picture scrolls and the message in their hearts, preaching to their own people. Once they were trained, African evangelists were good at preaching to their own people. By the time they had a basic knowledge of the Adventist faith, they were able to carry out the mission without further guidance from the white missionaries. They used their God-given talents and being guided by the Spirit of God, they were able to communicate the divine truth to those to whom they ministered. In general, the new evangelists translated the Christian message through a clever apprehensions of indigenous concepts, while they could recognize and accept most of the African core values such as charity, hospitality, and the spirit of Ubuntu. They also expressed their revulsions against the drinking of alcohol, the eating of unclean meats, and the worship of pagan gods in line with the Adventist lifestyles and standard. Thus, they advocated for the destructions of pre-existing rituals and beliefs that run against the teachings of Christianity. While all the new evangelists preached with determinations, their ultimate goal was to communicate their new faith, which they believed was superior to that of their ancestors, who did not mention Jesus in their religious gathering. While they emphasized the love of God in their sermons, the new Christian evangelists used simple sentences, which created a sharp effect on the mind of those who treated them with death. The African evangelist knows how to draw illustrations from native life that brings home the message as no foreign missionary could possibly do. The story of Stephen and the apostles of Christ, such as Peter, James, John, and Paul, stimulated in them the passions for God's missions that no human threat was able to quench. Sometimes they openly confronted the practice of juju as the idol and defeated it in the name of Christ. Let's give a story of Daniel Giazi in Ghana, a convert in 1950. As a new evangelist, John appeared Dankwa to remove his idol and juju from his house and throw them away. Dankwa wrote, one bright Sabbath morning on the 16th September 1950, Mr. and Mrs. Veta, Mrs. Gibson, Mrs. Appiah, and myself went to the village. After the church service, the man brought in his various idols, and in the presence of the village chief, his elders, and the town folks, the man stood in the midst of the people and witnessed for the wonderful message of Christ, which has changed his heart to commit to the flames this rubbish idol. What powerful testimony here. I pour kerosene on them, and a stick of match raised a towering flame, numbing bonfire, and devoured the whole thing without reserve. The flames of the fire must have appealed to the minds of the awe-striking populace who were looking to the worthless idols they once served and worshipped. A similar incident was recorded in Omuhua village, as wrote Wikwe, that there was a young man and his mother who requested that prayer be offered for them and that their juju be taken away from them, their idol be taken away from them. There was a young man in this village, as he wrote, as Wikwe wrote, and his mother, 70 years of age, who were converted to the truth on a Sabbath a few days ago. This young man and his mother requested that we come and destroy their juju. The old woman has a familiar spirit. She began to explain how much she had suffered since her connection with juju. One large room was set apart for the juju. Then we used a basket, packing them up to the street and burned them up. A sermon was given them that God is a true creator. All the false God will perish in the days of the Lord's anger. After the sermon, the repentant man began to ask what good thing he could do to become a real Christian. I told him, not until you enlist your name in the baptismal class will we let you know. May the Lord help this man and make his decision a firm one together with his mother so as to stand fast in their faith, as wrote Wikwe. So we see powerful demonstrations of faith by local pioneers. A number of Seventh-day Adventist new evangelists can enlighten our understandings of what we have been looking at. What we have been looking at. So let's look at a few of them and how their contribution, have been very significant to the growth of Adventism in Africa, and how they converted so many people to the Adventist faith. We can speak of Richard Moko, for instance, from South Africa, ordained into the gospel ministry in 1915. He was the first ever Black ordained ministers in the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Africa. A talented man, Moko had the gift of languages. He could read and write English and Dutch, and he was able to, preach to his own peoples and convert them to the Adventist faith. And of course, we can speak of Isaiah Balogun in Nigeria as well, very effective evangelist who also converted so many people to the Adventist faith in Nigeria. We can speak of Charles Mensah in Ghana as well, who converted so many people as well to the Adventist faith, and that is in Ghana especially. So his contributions are well documented as well. We can also speak of a Reward Nduvlo, that is from Zimbabwe. He became pastor in 1956. Under his leadership, indigenous people joined the Seventh-day Adventist Church in large numbers, as reported by F.G. Reid in 1963. We can also speak of Diamond Lufungulu, that's from Zambia. He began his pastoral work in 1958. He inspired young people to the ministry, and so many people also joined the Adventist faith because of his ministry. Now, let's speak of methods used by these Adventist evangelists. Not all the experiences and mission stories of local pioneers have been documented, as we have highlighted earlier. That is clear. But the few ones that have been documented, can help us, retrace the methods and strategies used by these pioneers on how to convert people to the Adventist faith, or let me say, to the Christian faith. But a few writings about their missionary activities documented in West African Messenger, the South African Missionary, the African Division Outlook, and the Trans-African Division Outlook attest to not only their dedication to the Adventist faith, but most especially their ability to become more creative, to be more creative in their approaches to preaching the gospel to their people through common sense and critical reasoning. Most of the evangelistic meetings did not take place in churches, as the local pioneers, work efficiently as they preach. They did not hold evangelistic meeting, in churches, since there weren't many church buildings before the 1930s. Evangelistic gatherings took place under trees, in private houses, in market places, and in open air places. These are places, these were places where the local evangelists, had evangelistic meetings in early Seventh-day Adventism in Africa. A sophisticated means of evangelism deployed by the new evangelist was the sale of Christian books. Literature evangelism was significant and accounted for most of the increase in membership among the elite, as it targeted those who were able to read and write, who in turn shared their new discovery and new faith with members of their household. Hundreds of literature evangelists pledged their commitment to Christ and service to humanity as they entered every corner of Africa to spread the word of God and the message for the salvations of humanity. Perhaps the most spectacular forms of Christian witness were instances when local pioneers openly defied the threats of witch doctors by freeing people from their curses. The local evangelists also destroy house idols and release people from the duty of worshiping them, as we have seen earlier in the stories that I've given in this paper. Now, when people notice the demonstration of such extraordinary faith in the God of Christianity. They surrender their lives to Christ as the only person who truly protects from evil forces. Many of the famous cases of evangelism were when idol worshippers agreed for the local evangelists to throw their idols into rivers or openly burn them before the eyes of everyone. Local evangelists were accompanied in their faith demonstrations by the rhythmic and musical sounds of traditional instruments, followed by powerful Christian hymns, sometimes through dramatic experiences of healing, deliverance from evil spirit, or confrontations with African traditional practices. The Adventist message penetrated the cities and the rural areas slowly, with difficulty, but with the clear assurance of hope. So by the early 1960s and late 1970s, as African countries gradually obtained their independence from their colonizers, they came to be more creative in adapting methods taught by the white missionaries. By this time, mass evangelistic campaigns in towns and villages were visible. Camp meetings were also organized here and there with the clear intent to increase the Adventist population in Africa. So in conclusion, African Adventist local evangelists were the major players who sought to present the biblical truth to their families and near and distant communities with a passion equal to that of their mentors, the Western missionaries. Following the general trends of independence, African Adventist evangelists sought not only to assure the continuity of the teachings of the church, but also to develop strategies for touching the hearts of non-believers whose customs and traditions gave little hope to Western missionaries that they could be rich and accept the Adventist faith. From South Africa to Ghana, Nigeria to Zimbabwe, Kenya to Egypt, the new evangelists spared no means to preach the gospel of Christ. They reached hundreds of thousands of people and led them to accept Adventism. Between the 1960s and the 2000s, the growth of the church was impressive, as skills taught by the Western missionaries were integrated and redefined intuitively by people who had only a rudimentary education. Their labor transformed Adventism in Africa to a major religious movement, which is likely to prove its strength further as thousands become Adventists each year. Thank you for listening. I'm waiting for your questions. God bless you. Amen.
Thank you very much, Dr. Masfa, for this presentation. And I just want to encourage our participants and attendees to ask questions. And while we are still waiting for questions, I just want to ask some questions. First of all, I want to ask you a question about the missionaries in the beginning of the 20th century. As far as I know, please correct me if I'm wrong, that most of the population in Africa in the beginning of the 20th century were illiterate. And we Adventists usually are people of the book. Even how the message was spread in the 19th century in the United States, it was through the printed materials. So how did the evangelists, the local evangelists, cope with this issue when, for example, they had to preach to the people who cannot read? How can they just give them the Bible, and how can they convert people who cannot even check from the Bible if it is true or not? Yes, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Felix, for this very important question. Well pleased by that. And as we have heard from the presentation, of course, by the 1960s, there was some progress already in Africa in terms of scope. So many countries have implanted schools and even Adventist schools by then by the local evangelists or the Western missionaries. So that's basically what they did. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have one more question. So in your presentation, you said that in the middle of the 20th century, the strategy of evangelism changed. So the evangelists adopted like more Western ways of evangelism. Did I understand you correct?
Yeah, you are right.
Evangelistic programs.
Yeah, you are right. Yeah, by
and
that time, you know, in the early beginning of Adventism in Africa, of course, we didn't have the open, you know, campaign. Let's say, you know, the mass evangelistic meetings, you know, as what it was done in the Western world. By the middle of the 20th century, things changed because we also adopted some of these strategies of mass evangelism. You know, as we have seen, you know, by that time, so many evangelistic campaigns were conducted, and also hundreds or even thousands of people will be baptized just in single days, as we have seen.
My question
so that was a big change.
My question is, what strategy do you think is better? The strategy that was, of course, we cannot compare them, but what advantages and disadvantages of those strategies? Strategies that were used by the first pioneers, local evangelists, or the strategies that were adopted later on from Western approach?
I think we have to look at the context, the historical context first. You know, by the early, let's say, 1900s, so things were a little bit different. Adventism was just beginning in Africa, and the methods used by the local peoples or the early Western missionaries were very relevant. You know, they went to the byways and highways to preach to people, and they conducted evangelisms, you know, in houses, you know, home fellowships. So those were practical strategies because they were still trying to build a kind of workforce to be able to support the Adventist mission in Africa. So
thank you very much. And we have one more question. Sorry for interrupting you. We have one more question, and unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time to answer. So the question is, what is your take on the aspect that the average African convert didn't feel the gospel as an adequate answer to their issues? That in various times, such as during crisis, many would revert to their traditional faith. Can you please answer very briefly, because our time is almost over?
Yeah, I think these are some of the issues that, of course, missiologists are struggling with. I'm not a missiologist, but I provide the answers from a little bit of, you know, historical perspective. But I can say that I think that's it can be connected to the issue of translations of the Christian message, or providing clear substitute, biblical substitute to the, you know, struggles of Africans people. Now, when the Christian message is translated to them in a way that can be connected to their life experience or the Christian experience, I don't think that when they face issues or struggles, they will now have to abandon their Christian beliefs and then run to, let's say, maybe to the witch doctors and to be able to find solutions to practical issues of life. So let's translate the Christian message to them properly so that it can be connected to their life experience. And by doing that, I believe they will not resort in times of struggles in life.
Excuse me for interrupting you, because our time is over. And I just want to add to this question that we will have tomorrow the panel discussion with Dr. Bauer and Dr. I forgot the name, about the dual allegiance and conversion. So maybe this question will be addressed. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Masfa. And I just want to add that we will have a network session, and Dr. Masfa will be also one of the moderators of the session, and you can ask more questions there. Thank you. We are starting next meeting, and we will leave this one and we will join to the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with
Much
us.
appreciated.